I'm back in the saddle doing some more interviews, and this time it's not Australia, but it's actually transatlantic. I've got Christian Westbrook, otherwise known as the Ice Age Farmer, and I have to say, Christian, welcome to the UK. And we've had a baking hot day today, which is most unusual for September. I'm a great admirer of your work, and I don't think I've ever actually said that to anybody on any of my videos before. To live up to, I think, now. We're going to do, for the audience, we've got part 1, and then we're going to follow it up with part 2. So, part 1, Christian, would you like to introduce yourself, if for people who've never actually heard of you?
Sure thing, Caroline. Thanks for that kind words, and thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here. I do run a YouTube channel over at Ice Age Farmer, and it's still there somehow. I also have a website at iceagefarmer.com in case that YouTube ever disappears. And yeah, my focus is really on the natural cycles of the sun and how that affects agriculture and the food supply on this planet. And then more recently, how the powers that shouldn't be are taking advantage of that collapse in agricultural production to seize control over society and over the food supply, and use that engineered scarcity to force us to acquiesce to their agendas. And so it's a big topic, and I think it's an important one, and that's why I talk about it. And that's also why I appreciate you having this conversation today. So thanks again.
So we're talking about solar minimums. You're living in a country which is, from what I can see on mainstream media, it's been ravaged by fire in certain parts of the country. I think you're probably near one of those fires. Are you close to one of those fires?
At this point, they are, we're surrounded by them, but there was one a couple weeks ago that actually forced us to evacuate, and we're not in that situation right now, mercifully. So, but yeah, you're exactly right. The whole West Coast is being burned up right now. And especially the governors, Oregon, Washington, Governor Newsom here in California, are certainly out there talking about why this is all going on, blaming global warming, saying the science is settled now, just look at these wildfires. Of course, they're just delivering on the promise that Jerry Brown made 2 years ago after the Paradise fires burned down that entire town not too far from here, where Jerry Brown said, there will be more fires. We will make believers out of even the staunchest climate deniers. So this is really just, the floggings of weather warfare and engineered fires. All of these attacks on society are trying to, it's much like the food. They're trying to make the case that we need to give up all of our rights and all of modern civilization and return to this post-human, post-carbon world that they imagine for us. It's an alarming situation.
You mentioned Paradise. Do you mean Paradise, the area of Paradise in California?
Yeah, there is a town called Paradise. A lot of it burned down. It was an interesting, just in terms of the words, it was an interesting situation where there was something called Diablo winds that then caused fires, which burned down Paradise. And there's another one of these situations where you can see encoded into the symbology, the way that they work, sending these hidden signals in Twilight language. And that happened 2 years ago now.
I was going to say, because it was 2 years ago when I fronted quite a well-known channel in the UK, and I did interview a few people from California, and they were talking about the patchwork quilt. It was almost like it was being ethnically cleansed, or certain neighborhoods were being cleansed, that you actually, if you looked from the air, it was patches of being burnt to the ground, and then patches which had hardly been touched. And my understanding was that houses with smart meters, they tended to fare worse. Is that right? Has there been any record of this at all?
I hadn't heard that one, but it was certainly the case that there were a lot of weird things about these fires. My neighbor has actually been a fire chief with Cal Fire for decades now. And so I went to him and said, you've got a breadth of experience, a huge depth of experience here. What are you seeing in these fires? Because there's so much, you go online and it's always hard to tell what's what's misinformation or disinformation and what's real when you see giant lasers, the directed energy weapons, giant lasers coming from the sky, and it looks like they're starting fires. But is this just misinformation seeded there? It's really hard to sort through this. And so I talked to this neighbor of mine, and he said, yeah, we've never seen anything like that. And of course, a lot of people will be quick to say, Carolyn, that that's because they're spraying this particulate matter, the geoengineering, a lot of accelerants, right, with the barium and strontium. So it can be hard to sort through all of these sometimes competing truths. But we can definitely say that the fires behaved in unprecedentedly bizarre ways. And that, yeah, there were instances where one house would burn down and then there'd be a section of trees right next to it that was fine, or a car that was, melted. The metal was melted. So a lot of bizarre things in these fires.
So I know I've seen a lot of your work, and you focused on, is it Tyson's food processing? Is it Tyson?
Tyson is one of the big meat processors, yeah.
Yeah, and so it seems to me that there are certain states which are okay, and there are other states which are struggling because maybe one food processing plant would be feeding, I don't know, 4 million people. So they're quite big. They're obviously big meat processing places. Of course, we know about the United Nations Agenda 2030, and I have seen records on your side of the Atlantic as well about the new Green Deal. Now, this is something that is being mooted over here as well. But I think it's not necessarily the new Green Deal is being passed as an overall package through Parliament. It's a case of we're looking at rewilding. I was talking to a friend today, he's a farmer, and he lives in the southwest, which is Devon. And he was saying that his local council was planning to devote 40 acres, 50 acres to the planting of trees. Now, that might sound a very small area for if you live in America, but it's a sizable area here. And I said, well, what was that land used for before? And he said, for agriculture. Mm-hmm. So this is an example of what is actually going on under our noses, but we're just perhaps not aware of this.
You're exactly right. And I was noticing a study that came out just last week from the UK where they made the case that it's laughable, Carolyn. They said farmers could make more money if they stopped farming and just grew trees instead. And of course, the way that they make this work out is through artificial incentives, carbon offsets, these kinds of things. But this is nothing to do with the real economy, right? Where there's actually goods produced and then capital exchanged for them. It only works in this contrived technocratic situation where they can print unlimited funds and then use that capital to incentivize the future that they want and to artificially engineer it. And I do recall just in the earlier part of this year, Professor Ian Boyd had come out and said, we need to rewild half of the UK's farmland in order to restore biodiversity and reduce our carbon emissions. And it's a long article about how we can save the world, Green New Deal style, but never once is there any thought whatsoever given to what about the food that was coming out of half of our farmland? What are we going to do, especially if we enter this Brexit situation and suddenly we need to be more responsible for growing food domestically? How does that jive at all with rewilding half of our farmland? And it's really astonishing to see this kind of just lack of thought, lack of depth of thought given to the situation. And yeah, we need to let people know.
Well, you mentioned that dreaded B word, the Brexit situation, and having been the Brexit nationwide campaign manager, I can't believe that we've got ourselves into such a situation where 4 and a bit years on after we voted to leave, and in fact we were taken into the EEC as it was known way back on the 1st of January 1973, we were taken in unlawfully, and the referendum to ask our permission was held some 2 years after we were taken in. And you see, now we step back and we can see that the EU, as it became, bringing 28 countries together, have produced all these rules and regulations, which has made it very difficult for the British farmer who's accepted his. Some of those British farmers, dare I say it, have accepted their pieces of 8. So they have accepted that they would let the farmland lie fallow, plant flowers, wildflowers, whilst we have been importing French beans from Kenya, presumably coming into the EU from Kenya and then being distributed out of Rotterdam, which is the Rotterdam effect. We get so much produce, food produce, from the EU. Even if they haven't produced it, it comes from there. And I always worried about the fact that they could turn that tap off tomorrow. I mean, this is the first year watching your programs, going into lockdown in the UK. I have a tiny, tiny back garden. There's a lot of people. I'm grateful to have one. There are a lot of people that have no garden now in the UK at all. What with the smart cities and just generally, there's a lot of shared housing ownership, which we didn't used to have, say 30, 40 years ago. You tend to buy your house outright, if you like, go for a mortgage. So there's a lot of houses now and flats which do not have the luxury of a little bit of garden. And I know you can say, well, you know, if you've got a balcony, plant some basil and you could put a few carrots in a tub. But realistically, even with my little back garden, and I have planted in every little nook and cranny in the back, it's a case of we can't really, you know, you get the snails coming along, and if you you know, you can end up literally overnight, you've just got holes in all your leaves. So it's not so easy to grow your own, especially the first time. I mean, you do learn some lessons. You do actually need a lot more land than perhaps I've got. I know they go on about growing upwards. Water's a problem. I talk to Australia quite a lot. I've got quite a connective work there. And basically their water is so expensive for their farmers that the farmers can't afford to farm anyway because it's just not cost effective. So there are other issues. I mean, in the UK, they're talking about something called the Water Partnership Aid. And some of the water companies, because UK has several water companies, and they basically, in their bill, some of them are actually itemizing an extra third of the bill, and that money is being used for media purposes, for people to send money to the third world. Well, the thing is, the UK, with the lockdown, it's becoming a third world because we can't get an NHS dentist now. So sorry, that was quite a big story there, but it's just giving you a potted history, a potted scene, if you like, of what's actually happening in the UK now.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And, you know, looking at Australia, I just did a report yesterday on the fact that as a consequence of this terrible management of their water supplies, you know, the Chinese ownership of a lot of it and of their politicians, that they had one of the worst rice harvests, in fact, the worst rice harvest on record last year. And then because these farmers knew that the situation would not be that much different this year, 90% of those rice farmers didn't even plant. They didn't even try this year to get a crop. And so, of course, now Australia's saying we're going to run out of domestically grown rice by Christmas. And we will then be, like you just said of the UK, we will then be dependent on imports from Vietnam and from other rice producers. And we see more and more of these cases of countries losing their domestic production and entering this dependence on global trade and the rest of the world. And it's not a sustainable situation. You know, Vietnam, on whom they're now relying, only earlier in this year, as the coronavirus situation was sort of burgeoning on the scene, summarily stopped all of their exports and said, whoa, we gotta, you know, we are the #1 exporter of rice in the world, but we're going to stop that for a second just to make sure that we can feed our own people and that prices domestically don't fluctuate too much. And it was only once they sort of resolved those internal situations that then they started exporting again. And it came out just this week that the Australian PM had been on the phone probably frantically to Vietnam saying, please, you guys got to keep exporting to us. We don't even have rice here anymore. We really need it. So can you keep that rice coming. So yeah, you see there's an increasing level of systemic stress on global trade, especially around food. And these are just a couple, the water supply being deliberately mismanaged and cut off in Australia, some of the things you mentioned in the UK. In the US, it's taking a different form where they're pointing at the harvest labor and saying we need to protect these migrant workers from coronavirus. And so we need to use social distancing on farms. And in many cases, we need to stop the harvest altogether. Jay Inslee, the governor of Washington, literally came out, Carolyn, and said the words, "It's too dangerous to harvest our crops right now. We just need to let it go. Just protect the farm workers." And so a lot of Washington's multi-billion-dollar apple harvest, it's their biggest agricultural output in Washington state, was left there to rot this year. And it's stunning. So it takes different forms in different parts of the world, but without question, they are systematically attacking food production and pushing us, nudging us using social engineering towards the lab-grown meats, the fake foods, the upcycled foods where they've taken trash and turned it back into something and calling it coffee or, a protein bar. It's truly an interesting situation.
I noticed that Vietnam wasn't the only country. I think Russia stopped exporting their rice. I think they're the number 2 producer. So yes, that was something that I was recommending people prep on. And I have, you Americans, I've got to admit, you probably produce more prepping films every week and have done than anywhere else in the world. And, I'm very interested to watch some of the programs where your guys and girls literally seem to go into the desert and set up in tunnels and holes in the ground and holes in the mountains, and you really go to town. Is it 1% of the US population are classed as proper preppers now?
I have not heard that number. That's an interesting one.
Yeah. So, because there's quite a Bible element in America. I noticed when I was over there last year, I'm quite familiar with America, and you've got so many radio stations tuned to the God channels, if you like. And so you've obviously got people who are prepping on that basis as well, for sure. They're saying this is the end times and we need to prep, and they're preparing for Armageddon, aren't they? Some of them.
Without question. And there's a lot of, in Utah, for instance, there's a large Mormon population where being prepared is actually part of their guidance, part of their religion. And so that you see in Utah, there's, I think, more than half are, by a long shot, are at least have a good long-term food supply, which is a really good idea, in my opinion.
Well, we're sort of, at the minute, we don't have the problems in obtaining fresh meat that I get the impression that because of Tyson's doing what they've done and had to shut processing plants down, things like bacon seem to be hard to get hold of. Is that right?
It's really touch or go, and it depends a lot on where you are. I've noticed, just based on the data that people send me, pictures of their supermarket shelves, things like this, and also hearing from floor managers at Walmarts and Kroger's and Whole Foods around the country, it tends to be the case that grocery retail establishments in the cities actually have stayed pretty well stocked. They really want they want to manage that perception pretty closely. So people in the cities, they want to keep them under the spell. Everything is fine. Stay asleep. Just wear your mask and stay locked down. And where the shortages are actually being felt more acutely is in rural situations where they don't seem to put the priority on stocking the shelves out in the country. But there have been more visible examples. For instance, Wendy's running out of beef and saying we don't have hamburgers at our hamburger fast food establishment, or pizza places that have run out of pepperoni. A lot of these sort of processed meats shortages, and in some cases, I think those are being talked up quite a bit. Made perhaps more visible than they actually are, so that people are made aware of them, and then they can be, like I said, socially engineered into this new direction. They want people to feel a little bit of pain so that they are primed for that problem reaction solution kind of a mentality.
Well, we've got, we've got quite a small landmass compared to you guys over in America. So that's another reason why I'm really concerned. Yet we're building lots more houses. We're talking about rewilding. They're pushing through with this super fast train, which isn't that fast at all, the HS2, which was probably the train that was featured in the film The Hunger Games and To Kill a Mockingjay, whichever one it is. So that, so this is, they tell us everything, what they've got planned before it happens. Yet we have this potential food shortage. And we saw that firsthand, actually, with the coronavirus, because once that lockdown was announced, the supermarkets' shelves were pretty empty. 24 hours, gone. And, I don't live in a city. I don't live in the village. I live in just a small town. So somebody once said that in America, they used to keep your houses full of grain for 6 months worth. And now is it barely a week's worth that you store for? So that's always going to lead to trouble, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is something that humans have done since the beginning of time, was make sure that we had some food set away. And it's pretty stunning. The U.S. had moved to completely liquidate what we called our strategic grain reserves, where the government held a lot of grains in reserve in case there were problems with food production. But as of 2008, that was just undone. We sold it off, and we only hold cash right now. And you can it's called the Bill Emerson Trust Fund. You can look it up on Wikipedia, where it unambiguously states that the U.S. can use these funds to help out a country somewhere else in the world with food problems. But if there is a global food supply problem, then obviously the money won't help. And so you're right. That's where we are now. There are a lot of farmers that still have, grain bins and on-farm storage, although a lot of that was taken out in the derecho not too long ago. But there is no official strategic grain reserve for the American public at this point. It's stunning.
So it's every man for himself and woman for themselves. I've said to prep for a year now, and because of the Brexit situation as much as anything. So where do we go from here then? What's the future? I mean, for us in the UK, the transition deal, we're in limbo land at the moment. We're coming to the end of the transition period where we'll be on our own, supposedly on the 1st of January. That's how it's supposed to appear anyway. So we've got a long, hard winter ahead. How do you see the coronavirus situation panning out? Because you've had quite a high number of alleged records anyway, of fatalities. And we have as well. I've uncovered many people's deaths have not actually had anything to do with COVID-19 at all. They haven't even been tested for coronavirus or COVID-19. The tests can't differentiate between flus and colds and this coronavirus 19. So we're heading for a second lockdown here. What's happening over with you?
It sounds much the same. Yeah, there is what's best described as a case-demic, where there are no longer any deaths really taking place. But if you look at the charts, it's all testing positive. And of course, the New York Times even came out just a week and a half ago and said, well, it looks like these PCR tests are giving us 90% false positives, which is something that a lot of people have been saying, including medical professionals, have been saying from the beginning. So we have a situation where whatever you may think about the virus, whether it's real or bio, let's set that aside, because we can already say deterministically that the testing is a disaster, that the stats are drastically inflated, and that they're being used as a weapon. This is a weaponized medical thing that's coming in and being used to shut down the meat plants. It's now being used to shut down the farm production. You mentioned Tyson, and there are a couple others like JBS and Smithfield, but they are one of the main ones, meat processors here in the U.S. And they were among the first workplaces to mandate coronavirus testing for their meat factory workers. And of course, when there's a 90% false positive rate, that means that they started, lo and behold, everyone started testing positive, and so they shut down their meat processing plants for a time. It was entirely predictable, and it has the effects of reducing, it has actually caused a huge amount of problems for all the producers who have pipelines of cows and chickens and pigs that are coming up and getting fat and ready for slaughter. And when there's no place to take those animals, then the animals were forced to cull to the tune of millions of each of these animals. And that's not, those are huge, devastating blows, not just for our food supply, but for the farmers themselves. And so this is an attack on the farmers and the ranchers who are already under tremendous economic stress. And then when they lose an entire crop of animals like that, it's just, it has put a lot of them under, and they're seeing more bankruptcies again this year. But this is now being used again. We've seen in the past month now, Michigan, where Governor Whitmer, and then Washington, Governor Inslee, Oregon, California, have all started to mandate, just like the meat plants, now that it's harvest season, we're starting to mandate CV-19 testing for farm labor. And again, when we get these false positives back, then suddenly we can make the case, oh, we got to shut down the farms. It even sounds ridiculous to say that, but it's happening. In Ontario as well, there's a premier, Doug Ford, who went through this whole rigmarole. Lots of activists demanded that we protect the harvest workers and shut down the farms. And he did. He acquiesced and said, we're going to shut down these farms. And so now that's sort of spreading as the harvest time makes its way south. That same thing is happening here, where Governor Newsom has sent out COVID-19 farm strike teams. Really, it's what they're calling these things, to go out and make sure that all of the OSHA guidelines, this social distancing is taking place on farms. And in the event that it's not happening, they issue massive fines and shut down these farms. And it's appalling. It's being used as a weapon to engineer food scarcity.
Well, let's just hold up there. Let's call it the end of part one. And to the audience, I'd love it if you could join us for part two. Is that okay with you, Christian?
That works. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, we'll be back in a few minutes. I'll see you again soon. It's been Caroline Stevens Seeking the Truth. And I can't say please subscribe to my YouTube channel, because my YouTube channel has been removed. And there, I'm wearing the badge of honor. So Christian, please join me on part two. Thanks to everybody, and I'll see you in a few minutes. Goodbye for now.